So, the bell ringer, of course. Why do you think the U.S. has the most prosperous economy in the world? And that was typed into Canvas chat. And of course, that relates to what we're going to be talking about, looking at the big picture or macroeconomics. Hopefully, you had a chance to take the citizenship quiz. It's just 10 questions. It's required by the state of Pennsylvania. So if you just clicked on take the quiz, you'll go through the 10 questions that you'll have that are randomly drawn from the actual citizenship test. But anyway, the next thing, of course, was the reading assignment, and hopefully you're able to click on the link to open up your own copy of the document. You just need one main point per section or half page, and then an interpretation on the left-hand side per section. And the notes, hopefully you're able to open the document, make a copy. The first day we'll be talking about the gross domestic product. So let's go ahead and start with that. The gross domestic product. And the gross domestic product is defined as the value of products made within a country's borders. The value of products made within a country's borders. So, everything produced by Ford in the borders of the United States and everything produced by Toyota, because Toyota has factories in the United States too. So, even if it's a foreign company, it still gets included in America's GDP. And it's used by economists and leaders and businesses to basically determine future policy. So the government needs to know what it will have to do when it comes to spending and taxes in the next year. Businesses will know if they can expand or not, or borrow money based upon the gross domestic product. And there are two ways of calculating the GDP. Two ways of calculating the GDP. The first way is called the expenditure approach. And this is when you add together the value of all goods and services made minus the trade deficit.
All goods and what made?
All goods and services made minus the trade deficit. So, what that means is the trade deficit is if we end up buying more than we sell. And we have been in that boat for a number of years. So we end up subtracting the amount that we sell is greater than what, or excuse me, the amount that we buy that greater than what we sell from the value of what we made. The second way is the income approach, and that's simply adding together the incomes made in the United States. Just to give the simplest explanation of it. And both these ways come up with about the same number. And when we first started this part of the course, I mentioned that economists like simplified explanations, and the GDP is exactly that. It's not a complete picture of our economy. So there are downsides to using it. And here's a few things that it does not take into account. One would be types of items produced. Types of items produced. If you had country A and country B, each with a $1 trillion GDP, you might think, oh, they're exactly the same. But if one produced coal and one produced computers, well, obviously one is going to have a different standard of living, the health of their employees, and education is going to be different. So types of items produced is something that GDP does not take into account. Another item would be health. Maybe country A and country B have a GDP of $1 trillion. So they look equal on paper, but maybe country B only has an average life expectancy of 50 years. So the GDP isn't necessarily indicative of how well off those people are.
Thank you. Thank you. I was looking for that word today.
Then, of course, there's the black market. This is any type of selling that's done under the table. In countries like the United States, it just includes illicit activities, drugs, prostitution, things like that. But in other countries, it makes up a huge part of the economy. In North Korea, because the economy is essentially controlled by the government and they quite honestly don't do a good job, average citizens have to buy things like even Band-Aids, for instance, through the black market.
Is it true that if you're caught working for the black market in North Korea, you're shot on sight?
I don't know if you're shot on sight. You might be taken to a different location and shot.
Yeah, different location.
Yes. Then another thing the GDP doesn't take into account are households. If you mow your family's grass, if when you were growing up, one of your parents stayed at home to look after you, these are kinds of things that have value to them. And if someone else did them, you would pay them for it. But since you're doing them as part of your household for free, it's not included in the GDP. If you think about it, before the 1950s, when almost all women stayed at home to raise their children, just think about the value of that. It would have been worth tens of billions of dollars, but that's not included in the gross domestic product. Then there's also amount produced per person. Amount produced per person. And that's the thing, it depends upon who you ask about gross domestic product and what calculation is used. If you just go with the flat GDP, the United States has the greatest. If you use some other manipulations to it, China actually comes out as number one, and you might think, well, that's impressive. They've come so far in such a short time. But remember that even with that, they might be able to have a little bit higher GDP than us, but they have 1 billion more people. So obviously they're not as productive as the United States. Another one would be how goods are distributed. How goods are distributed. If country A and country B have a GDP of $1 trillion, and in country A, most people have a high standard of living, most people can buy basic consumer goods, but country B, all the wealth is controlled by just a couple of people, and most of the other people are starving or can't afford to buy stuff. Obviously, their $1 trillion GDP doesn't really mean that much. The next one would be over adjustment for inflation. Over adjustment for inflation. When we look at GDP growth, we look at it from year to year, and we try to take consideration, well, how much this was influenced by prices, because the value of all goods and services in the year 2020 is obviously going to be lower than in 2021. So is that because we produced more, or is that just because prices have gone up? So sometimes economists may over-adjust for that.
There's also under-adjusting.
That's right. That's possible too.
Because the living like minimum wage hasn't changed for years.
That's right. And then wealthy nations, nations with a high GDP, have some of the following things. And so, United States, China, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Brazil, India, and so on. They have some of these, but not necessarily all of them. So let's look at some of these things they might have. One would be natural resources. And this is something that the United States has thanks to our large geography. Other countries, Japan is high on the list. They don't. They have a small country because they have an archipelago, a group of islands with mountains on them, so they don't have a lot of natural resources. But they have some of these other variables, which is why they're high on the list. Two is technology and equipment. The United States is a designer and producer of technology and equipment. One of the reasons why the average American doesn't think the United States produces that much, because the things that we do produce aren't necessarily things bought by the average American. Airplanes, supercomputers, construction equipment, and so on. A third item would be a skilled and educated workforce. A skilled and educated workforce. And obviously, the United States has an advantage here because we require all people to go to school up to a certain age. Literacy is required as part of that education. Unlike other countries, some other countries, based on your skill level, you might not be eligible to complete education up through the 12th grade.
You know, if this were like the 1700s, like we'd be eligible to work in like court proceedings and such.
Yes, I mean, the average high school senior that graduates has a much greater education than most people. In fact, maybe even as good as some of the founding fathers did.
Math must have. If I did a polynomial math equation back in the 1700s, I would have blown everyone's minds.
Maybe. I mean, the elites, especially if they're involved in engineering and stuff like that, they would have known them. But otherwise, yes, but the average person would have no idea what you were talking about. Stable price levels. Stable price levels. Prices do go up in the United States, but the increase is usually incremental. So they're fairly reliable. Another one would be capital deepening. And this is capital spelled with two A's.
Capital what?
Capital deepening. Capital deepening. This simply means investment. Instead of just hiring more employees, they're also building and expanding, buying more equipment. Capital deepening. The next one would be savings. Now, this is one that we are sometimes good with, sometimes we're not good with. Other countries like India, the average person might save as much as 30 or 50% of their income. In the United States, when we're doing good, we're saving 6 to 10%. But there are some years when we're not, where we end up borrowing more than we actually end up saving as an average person. The next one would be population increase. A population increase means that you have healthy competition in your labor market. It means that there are more people that are going to consume goods and services. The United States, compared to other advanced countries, actually has a positive population growth rate, mostly thanks to immigration. The next one would be government investment. Government investment in infrastructure. Government investment in infrastructure. And this is one of the things we do okay with, but we kind of fallen behind some other countries. And the last one would be foreign trade. Foreign trade. All right, so that's all for the notes today. Tomorrow we'll talk about some of the ups and downs in the economy and the gross domestic product. For the remainder of the period, use the time to work on the reading. Try to get as much done as you can today.